The recent call from the Aboriginal Peak Organisation's Northern Territory to abandon the Territory Coordinator Bill highlights growing concerns over the balance of power within the Northern Territory government. Critics argue that the bill grants unprecedented authority to a single public servant, overriding existing laws and undermining Indigenous rights. The opposition from traditional owners and legal experts underscore the need for a government that respects community voices and prioritises Aboriginal self-determination. In Queensland, Cooma Elder Wayne Coco Wharton has launched a significant political party campaign as a lead candidate for the Indigenous Aboriginal Party of Australia. A landmark High Court decision has affirmatively changed the landscape of native title rights in Australia, holding the Commonwealth liable for substantial compensations to the Gumatj people. Amid distressing trends highlighted in the latest Closing the Gap report, Indigenous Australians face deteriorating outcomes in critical welfare areas. Lastly, the First Peoples Assembly of Victoria has voiced their criticism of recent changes to the state's bail laws that have contributed to alarming rates of Aboriginal deaths in custody. Kaya. I'm Leanne Jalandi-Dolby, and this is the National Indigenous Times Daily News Bulletin for the 13th of March 2025. The Aboriginal Peoples Peak Organisation's Northern Territory has called on the NT government to abandon the Territory Coordinator Bill, arguing that it grants excessive and unprecedented power to a public servant. APONT and the NT's 4 land councils believe that the bill undermines commitments under the National Agreement on the Closing the Gap and disregards public opposition. Traditional owners from the Beetaloo Basin have also voiced concerns following a parliamentary report that suggested only minor amendments. Dr. John Patterson, APONT lead convener, criticised the bill, stating, "Our work is underpinned by the principle of Aboriginal self-determination. We will not stand by as unchecked powers to overrule existing laws, threaten our people, our sacred sites, and our culture and our rights." Legal experts, including Greg McIntyre, have warned of the bill's extraordinary nature, cautioning it that it allows the Territory Coordinator to override existing decision-makers. APONT continues to urge the government to respect community concerns and reject the bill. Cooma Elder Wayne Coco Wharton has launched his campaign for Queensland Senate as the lead candidate for the Indigenous Aboriginal Party of Australia in the upcoming federal election. A long-time Aboriginal rights activist, Wharton is calling on yes voters from the Voice referendum to back his party, emphasising the need for genuine Indigenous representation in Parliament with real voting power, rather than just an advisory role. Wharton's campaign is built on the principles of Indigenous sovereignty, unity, and structural reform to empower Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities. Referencing the Mabo decision, he reaffirmed that sovereignty was never ceded on this land and called for equal representation of 300 Indigenous sovereign nations. He also urged unionists and progressive voters to support Indigenous candidates, arguing that the fight for workers' rights and Indigenous rights are deeply connected. Seeking both financial and grassroots support, Wharton made a heartfelt appeal. Our liberation and freedom will only come with the help of Australians with good hearts and open minds. His campaign aims to dismantle systemic barriers and bring Indigenous voices directly into the government to drive meaningful change. The High Court's historic land rights decision has been widely praised, affirming that the Commonwealth is liable for up to $700 million in compensation for extinguished native title rights. The case, initiated by the late Dr. Yunupingu on behalf of the Gumatj people, established that the loss of native title under the Commonwealth law before the Native Title Act constituted an acquisition of property under the Constitution. The ruling enforces that native title is legally protected like any other property, and that traditional owners must be compensated when their land is taken. This decision proves that native title is just like any other property acquired by the government, and reaffirms that owners deserve to be compensated for any loss, said Northern Land Council Chair Matthew Ryan. The latest Closing the Gap data reveals worsening outcomes for Indigenous Australians in critical areas, with child removal, suicide rates, and incarceration rates continuing to rise. The report, released on Wednesday, has been called a wake-up call by SNAICC, National Voice of Our Children, urging governments to take meaningful action rather than continuing a failing business-as-usual approach. While some progress has been made in employment, land rights, and early childhood education, alarming statistics show that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children are 11 times more likely to be placed in out-of-home care than non-Indigenous children. In Victoria, removal rates are the highest in the country, with reports of systemic failures linked to poverty, domestic violence, and racial discrimination. Productivity Commissioner Selwyn Button echoed these concerns, calling government inaction the definition of insanity. Despite federal commitments to the National Agreement on Closing the Gap, the report highlights the lack of substantial action. Indigenous leaders continue to call for policy changes that prioritise early intervention and community-driven support to prevent further regression in key metrics. Victoria's First Peoples Assembly has condemned the state's bail law changes, warning that they could repeat the past mistakes. The Labor government, led by Premier Jacinta Allan, has backflipped on its 2023 reforms, removing the principle of detention as a last resort and prioritising community safety in bail decisions for both children and adults. Reuben Berg, co-chair of the First Peoples Assembly, criticised the government for rushing the changes without consultation, warning that they will worsen the Indigenous over-incarceration. The Victorian Aboriginal Legal Service has called for additional funding to address the fallout, but the government has refused, insisting previous budgets provided adequate support. Berg urged the government to focus on addressing the root causes of crime through diversion programs and community-led solutions, rather than politically driven reactions. La Boite Theatre's centenary season opens with a bold reimagining of Macbeth, shifting the focus from titular characters to the Weird Sisters. Running from the 6th to the 22nd of March 2025, this groundbreaking production features an all-women of colour cast, with Aunty Roxanne MacDonald, Mel Reid, and Nicole Hoskins portraying every role in Shakespeare's tragedy. Directed by Courtney Stewart and Lisa Falaafi, Macbeth transforms the witches from mere bystanders into the storytellers, offering a fresh perspective on power, conflict, and consequence. The streamlined 90-minute adaptation maintains Shakespeare's language while exploring the burdens placed on women, especially women of colour, through oppression and war. Opening on International Women's Day, La Boite's Macbeth is a powerful reclaiming of a classic tale. That's today's Daily News Roundup from National Indigenous Times. For more news, head to nit.com.au and sign up for our free newsletter.